Hey everyone, this is Ben with the Tiger's Den, and today we're going to talk about my pick for the best deck in Standard if you don't want to play Field of the Dead. So this deck that we have right here, I'm calling it Royal Temur because we have the Royal Scions, we have the Questing Beast, which seems like a very regal sort of creature, and also there's a backstory with like King Pelennor and Knights of the Round Table. Look it up if you're interested. Not really relevant here. But anyway, so this is a Temur deck that I have been really high on since spoiler season. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, I guess, because really what happened is we saw Royal Scions and Oko Thief of Crowns get spoilered, and I went, hot dog, I would love to build a deck with both of those cards because they're both really powerful and really undercosted. And then Questing Beast was spoilered, and I went, wow, if you give that guy +2/+0 and First Strike and Trample, it gets really, really, really good. And then this deck was sort of born out of that. I got some additions here from other brewers and streamers, notably Jeff Hoagland has been really, really high on this deck, and the Sarkhans and the Arboreal Grazers both came in here at his recommendation. And yeah, this is kind of where we are at right now. There's no real solidified list for what people think the best version of this is, because this deck is really under the radar right now, in my opinion. So I just wanted to do a little deal here and just talk about it and why I think it's so much fun and so good in the field right now. Okay, so much fun. We're going to kind of get to that as we get to it, because that's pretty self-evident, I feel like. But so really good in the field. So what is the field right now? Well, right now it is basically Field, right? Like, Field of the Dead is the deck to beat. Pretty much the Golos version is the version that gets played. So, bring that up here. So it's this card right here. If you're playing Standard, you've seen this card a billion times. So it's Field of the Dead, and then decks that are all trying to beat Field of the Dead in some way, because this deck is pretty overrepresented right now, both in paper and on Arena, especially in some of the different, people that are really trying to climb seem to be playing a lot of this right now. So, Field of the Dead. How does this deck deal with Field of the Dead? Because you have to be able to deal with Field of the Dead in some way to really go very far in Standard right now. And to do that, you can do one of two things, basically. You can go underneath it, or you can go over the top of it. Underneath, meaning you just out-aggro the deck and you kill them before they can get their game plan online, and going over the top, meaning you basically get in with like flying or other sorts of evasive creatures that they can't really deal with, and that their board state doesn't do anything against. So this is pretty much in the latter category, because we have lots and lots of evasive threats, but also it sort of does the first thing too, because we can do those things very quickly thanks to having 8 turn 1 mana dorks and Once Upon a Time. So what this deck can do is, as early as turn 2, you can drop down an Oko to start making you an army of food, or the Royal Scions to start buffing your creatures and looting you into your relevant cards. If you get turn 1 Arboreal Grazer into Oko, this is turn 2 Oko that makes your Arboreal Grazer a 3/3. That is a Wild Nacatl, a 1 mana 3/3 creature. That card was banned in Modern for years. So being able to do that in Standard and also ramping yourself into this ludicrously undercosted, overpowered Planeswalker is amazing. So we can get our plan together really quickly because we have all this ramp, and our ramp comes online 1 turn earlier than the field deck's ramp, because their ramp starts usually, well, I guess they do have Arboreal Grazer, but usually it's starting with Growth Spiral, so they have like 4 1-drops, 4 2-drops, and most of their lands are coming into play tapped, so turn 1 Arboreal Grazer is harder for them. Whereas we have 8 turn 1 mana dorks, really easy time playing them on the curve, and the 4 Once Upon a Time to help us find more mana dorks. But once you've got that game plan together, we have other angles of attack too, because we have the Questing Beast, which can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less. It death touches Golos down, so even if they fog it with Golos for a turn, their Golos is dead and our Questing Beast is still on board, and since it has Vigilance, it's held back to block one of their zombies. We also have the Royal Scions giving Trample, First Strike, and +1 or +2/+0. We have Domri buffing it. Domri's also helping us fight down their blockers. We have Oko, who can turn their our Arboreal Grazers, or Gilded Goose foods, or Gilded Goose if we need it, or his own food, into an army of creatures, and all of our creatures outclass their zombies. And then, at the top end, we have Skargan Hellkite, which is a potentially hasty flying threat, which both the haste and the flying are incredibly important against field. And then we have Sarkhan. And with 12 Planeswalkers, 10 of which we can cast on turn 2 potentially, Sarkhan represents an absurd amount of damage because he can just, plop him turn 4, turn 5, and swing into our opponent for like 8 damage out of nowhere. And when we've been pressuring them with Questing Beast and, 3/3 Arboreal Grazers, that 8-12 damage that he sends in that's game. That's game most of the time. And maybe they can, block one with an Arboreal Grazer or something, but even then, that's so much pressure, and it's hard to deal with that at that point in the game because it takes so long for them to put their board plan together. And then on top of that, unless they have main deck Planar Cleansing, I think they usually have one in the sideboard, but game 1, they can't deal with these cards really. It takes too long for them to get their pressure together. So on top of that, Domri buffs the power of your Planeswalkers when they're dragons. Royal Scions can target your Planeswalkers when they're dragons, so you have even more ways of pushing that final damage through. Of course, Bone Crusher can also put you in for a couple points of damage and can just beat in when necessary, or block a zombie if that's necessary, but at that point you're probably in a pretty tough spot. But then, even on top of that, go back to the Royal Scions for a second. If you can play these guys on turn 2 or even turn 3, there are only very specific lines that the field deck can take where they can take these guys off of ultimating. And usually being able to do so means that they can't deal with your board. So you can very often just deal like 7, 8, even 9 damage to the face while drawing 4 cards with the Royal Scions. And that, when you're racing them down with creatures that can't even block and hasty flying Planeswalkers out of nowhere, that extra damage, that's going to go the distance. So anyway, we have tons of ways of fighting the field deck, and that makes it very potent against them. So on top of that, next thing, how about the decks that go underneath field? So for the decks that go underneath field, well, for one, we've all seen how good Arboreal Grazer is versus aggro decks, right? Like, this card is insane because it ramps you, and then it's a 0/3 body that is just going to block 1 or 2 damage every turn until they spend mana and a card to remove it, probably. On top of that, we have Gilded Goose. This can also block their 1/1s, or their 1/Xs. It's giving us food, it's ramping us, and then eventually, if we need to, it's turning into a 3/3 from Oko. It's also feeding Wicked Wolf and feeding Oko's ability with its food and gaining us life. So all of those abilities are so good, and even though Gilded Goose is, in a way, it's a downgrade from Llanowar Elves, it feels like it's actually better versus aggro in this deck by a considerable margin than Llanowar was. We all know how good Llanowar Elves is. We also have a couple of Bone Crusher Giants in here, and while the shock is overcosted, like 2 damage for a shock, even with the Rider Claws on there, is really bad, this is still fine versus, your opponent puts down a, Priest of Forgotten Gods or something, and you kill it before it can do anything, and then you have a creature afterwards. That's fine. That's fine. That kind of speed bump that you can present is great when you're ramping up into this top end that is just going to run them over. Additionally, Questing Beast, of course, is amazing because they have a hard time blocking it, and then it has Vigilance, so it's going to be back to block as well. And, Skargan Hellkite, if you start activating Skargan Hellkite versus, like, a red deck wins or something, they're going to have such a hard time coming back in because it's just free blow up your stuff every turn. And then, of course, Domri can fight their stuff, Oko can transform their stuff or swap it around, and Royal Scions is putting in lethal, before they can assemble it probably, so I've felt very favorable. In fact, I don't think I've ever lost a game versus aggro with this deck, nor have I lost a game versus field. It's only out of, I think, 25 or 30 games, but still, it's not a statistically significant number, but it is enough to get a feel for how the deck plays. Decks that go over the top, so these would be things like your Fires of Invention decks. And again, those kind of have the same problem that Golos has, because a lot of them are very slow to put their game plan together. And then even once they do, they're relying on kind of, get a board wipe and just resolve board wipe after board wipe and kill you. But the problem with that plan is that Questing Beast has haste, and they can't cast anything on your turn if they have fires out. Also, if they have a hard time dealing with resolved Planeswalkers, and we have tons of Planeswalkers, all of which are incredibly threatening, and then Sarkhan to make them into dragons and kill them. We also have the Skargan Hellkites getting in for the haste damage. So we have ramp, so that we're usually ahead of them on mana, so we can actualize our game plan before they can. So again, that is probably one of the matches where I drop more games, But then the one where I dropped the most has been the mirror. And of course, you know, in the mirror, you're going to go 50-50, right? Because someone's going to win, someone's going to lose, and it's always going to be the same deck. But less tongue-in-cheekily, it's the Nissa decks where they can, you know, we don't have Nissa, so if they can ramp out a Nissa while we're still trying to, you know, get our Planeswalker value or something like that, then we can be in a pretty bad spot, especially because Questing Beast, while it outclasses their elementals, it can't deal with Nissa in one hit. It needs at least two. And if you can't get this out on curve, more than that sometimes. So those, and of course they also have Oko in their decks, so you know if they slam their Oko before you slam your Oko, that's pretty tough. But so those, you know, value exchanges, we often can't quite outrace them, and then they have as much or more inevitability as we have. So it's more of a coin toss in my experience. The one deck where I think I've actually gone about even has been the Green-Black X adventure decks, because they're just packed with removal. They usually have a little bit of life gain in there, if I'm recalling correctly from the ones that I've fought. And they have such a strong value engine, so they can slam the brakes onto us really hard early and then outgrind us later. And in my experience, it's been hard to consistently put together enough of a life deficit on their end for us to just steal a game like that through their spot removal and stuff like that. Although because they have to keep Murderous Ridering your stuff and they're losing life off of that, and you can, you know, Wicked Wolf their guys and things, it's not like it's totally impossible, it's just a little bit tougher in my experience. So, alright, I've told you all that. Let me put my money where my mouth is. I've been keeping track of my statistics with this deck, and I played a different version of it without Sarkhan, because I wanted to test with Skargan Hellkite, which I don't have yet, and also with Gruul Spellbreaker, which I only have one of. And so I pulled the Sarkhans for those. And that didn't work out as well, because I had a worse record having done that than I've had overall. But, one, my purpose for that was to test, not necessarily to win, because I didn't want to make my goal win as many games as possible, because that was very unlikely. I wanted to make my goal learn what cards I would like to play with. So it didn't work out as well, but I still went 6-2, which is a 75% win rate. And the two games that I lost, one of them I went 7 or 8 turns without ever finding a blue source of mana, despite having all these blue lands, Gilded Goose, and Once Upon a Time to fix our mana. And then the other time, my opponent played turn 2 Oko on the play, and I did not find an Oko, and I lost, because my best line of turn 2 Oko never came to fruition, and my opponent did it instead. So 75% win rate overall, pretty good with that. But outside of the event, I've had an 88% win rate with this deck. 88% win rate. 100% win rate against aggro, 100% win rate against Golos. And the things in between, occasionally stealing a game here and there. And actually, I think that on the play, I have a 90-something, like, I think it's 94, 95% win rate with this deck. And then, you know, in the 70 or 80% on the draw. And it's largely because this line of Grazer into turn 2 Planeswalker, hopefully Oko, is so strong. So, having said all that, what is it that makes this so powerful? And it is largely that line. We have these 8 creatures plus 4 Once Upon a Time, and then these 10 really good, you know, these two, Scions and Oko, are what we want to aim for, but even Domri is pretty good on turn 2, because he can ramp our other things out, he can fight their stuff down, and he goes to 4 immediately? Yeah, goes to 4 immediately, so can't be just shot down or anything like that. So that line is so powerful, and when we can put it together, it's so hard to come back from. Like, what do you do against turn 2 Oko? Like, you can Noxious Grasp him. There aren't really any good lines against that. And if you went turn 2 Oko off of a Grazer, sure, you can Noxious Grasp him, but now we've ramped ourselves and gotten a Wild Nacatl out of the deal, and a food token, or not a food token, because we turned our Grazer into a 3/3. And we got 3 damage in. Or either that, or we like made you chump block with something. That's such a powerful line. The Scions are not as just play it and win immediately, but they have been so good because, as I mentioned, their buff ability is very powerful, but their first +1, the draw and then discard, is also amazing for this deck because we're a little bit greedy on mana, so looting helps us find the right lands. That's one thing it does. Another thing that it does is, you know how it feels terrible to draw an Arboreal Grazer late in the game? Well, now that our Arboreal Grazer just turned into whatever else is in our deck. Like, this is probably the worst top deck we can get, other than just getting too many lands. So, being able to just take Grazer and toss it and draw, like, a Wicked Wolf or something is insane. Next reason this deck has been so powerful is because, well, once upon a time, I mean, we're finding not only amazing creatures or the lands that we need to cast them, but we're also finding removal spells, because we can find a Bone Crusher Giant or a Wicked Wolf, and those can just kill our opponent's creatures. Even if we find a Questing Beast or a Skargan Hellkite, if we have Domri out, that's still finding a removal spell, because, like, especially Questing Beast just kills literally anything because it has Death Touch. You need to have Indestructible not to die to that. So we have this really nice toolbox element to it, and then on top of that we have the food synergy, because we have Gilded Goose, Oko, Wicked Wolf, and that's letting us make all these food, turn them into creatures, turn them into mana, turn them into an indestructible, getting bigger every turn, kills a thing when it comes into play wolf, and then it's letting us gain life, you know, for against a burn deck or something, we're gaining life. And then, of course, you know, we got our 2-for-1s here and things like that, so anyway, so many angles of attack here. This deck has been incredibly fun because it has so much game against virtually anything, and despite the fact that it's pretty linear, there's lots of interesting decisions that you're making, because looting with Royal Scions, that has a not huge but decent like decision point to it, how you're using your food, when you're using your Gilded Goose to ramp you, what you're doing with your Oko activations, because this card can do so many things. This is like one of the most difficult to use Planeswalkers I have ever encountered. Like, if you thought that brainstorming with Jace, Jace the Mind Sculptor was tough, oh boy, you know, when to steal your opponent's creature versus turn your guy into a 3/3 is something else. So, yeah, that is, it attacks on all of these different axes. It's great for people who love value, it's great for people who love beatdown, and in my experience, it's just great if you want to win some games. So, there is one thing that I'd like to point out with this deck, though, because this is a kind of tricky thing that I didn't realize until I'd played probably 20 plus games with this deck, and that is that you'll notice that there are no not Temple Mystery, there are no Fabled Passage in this deck, and that's not a budget concession. I have 4 of them. The reason for that is that after about 20-25 games with this deck, I went to myself, there have been so many times where I have had an opening hand that was Arboreal Grazer, 2 lands, and a Fabled Passage. And like we said, our #1 goal is to play a 3-drop on turn 2. And if those are the only 3 lands that you have, you cannot do that off of Arboreal Grazer. But in my experience, I didn't need, largely because of Once Upon a Time, and also the fact that Gilded Goose can, you know, give us our second red or green later, and we have plenty of green, so that's not too hard. But in my experience, I just found that there were so many games where I wanted to play that turn 2 Planeswalker, and this was our 3rd land, and I just had to sit there and go, there's no right way to play this handout unless my next card is a land. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And I mean, you can still play your thing on turn 3 that way, and that's great, but it's so much better to play it on turn 2. Like, that is basically the purpose of this deck, is to do that as soon as possible, and then, like, Questing Beast is a nice, cute thing to do after you've played your insanely overpowered 3-mana Planeswalker. So I replaced those with a couple of extra temples, and I think I went up to a 4th Steam Vent. But the reason that I put in those temples was because, whereas Fabled Passage is the worst thing we can put into play off of an Arboreal Grazer, temples are the best thing we can put into play off of an Arboreal Grazer, because the land's always coming into play tapped off of this card. So you might as well make it a land that's already coming into play tapped and giving you additional value while giving you 2 colors of mana. So it's great, you know, every turn that I have, like, Steam Vents, Forest, Temple, Grazer in hand, that's just, like, the absolutely ideal picture of what you can possibly have. So, love seeing stuff like that, and, you know, so, as such, I went from, I believe, 2 to 4 Temples, just to be able to put that line together more often. So, anyway, that has been my experience. If you're looking for a cool deck to climb with, I think this is a great choice right now. It has lines of attack against virtually everything, and especially one of the best decks in the format, and one of the most prevalent decks in the format. For games 2 and 3, we have a fantastic sideboard. So, for one, we've got Flame Sweep. Flame Sweep kills literally nothing in our deck, so that's great. Lava Coil for spot removal when you need to kill Priest of Forgotten Gods, Questing Beast, stuff like that. 3 Veil of Summer, because it's great. And then 4 Disdainful Stroke, and this is the other thing that Hoagland completely sold me on. And when he mentioned it, it was like, yeah, every deck out there is playing tons of really powerful 4-drops and higher. Like, you have Golos and Circuitous Route for one, and Time Wipe. And sure, sometimes they get their Teferi out, but then you just kill it with Questing Beast and you're fine. On top of that, you have like Fires of Invention decks that all of their stuff pretty much is 4 or more mana because they're building around 4+ mana cards. Then there's, you know, even like Questing Beast, like you can nab a Questing Beast. Like even Red Deck Wins is running Torbrand or whatever his name is, the dwarf. Like even, and of course there's Experimental Frenzy too, although I wouldn't bring this against Red Deck Wins, but I'm just putting it out there that, you know, pretty much everyone seems to be running these cards right now. And when we're playing this game where we're tempoing our opponent out so hard, 2 mana to answer 4 or more mana is just amazing, and often closes out the game, because we're applying so much pressure so fast that having that key Kaya's Wrath or something countered after we've already played a threat before it, you know, like spend 3 mana to play a Bone Crusher Giant out, and then have up 2 for Disdainful Stroke and counter their board wipe. That often just kills our opponent on the spot. And on top of that, because we have so much ramp, we can often play like Questing Beast and hold up Disdainful Stroke by the time our opponent even has 4 mana to begin with. So it's harder if we're on the draw, obviously, but it's not an uncommon occurrence where we can play our threats on the curve and then have Disdainful Stroke as soon as it's relevant after having played that on the curve threat. So anyway, it's a great card, and it's really, really good in this deck. I'm running the whole set. Last one here is Shifting Ceratops. I'm not 100% sure on this card, but, I mean, it's good versus Flash, obviously, and there's still a fair amount of Flash running around. It's good. It's actually really nice that it can't be blocked by Fae of Wishes because of the protection from blue claws, because Fae of Wishes is a pretty prevalent card right now, in my experience. And so, you know, getting in that 5 damage through that is great. Not being able to be bounced by Teferi, of course, is amazing. And then also, but really the reason this is here isn't because of any of those things. It's because there are some matches where cards like Wicked Wolf and Bone Crusher Giant just aren't super great. But you still, in my opinion, want to have a decent number of threatening creatures that you can grab off of Once Upon a Time, or that if you get a few of your creatures removed, you can just play them out of your hand and not have to go down. Because, you know, if you remove like 3 Wicked Wolves or a couple of Bone Crusher Giants, your number of creatures that you have that are threatening gets pretty low. But in a lot of those decks where these cards aren't great, Shifting Ceratops is actually pretty good. So you can take those out and put the Ceratops in to keep your threat density high, and of course, as I mentioned already, having semi-evasion and trample and having haste is so important right now, because again, in those decks where, you know, like versus your hard control lists where Wicked Wolf isn't as good, Shifting Ceratops and then hasting it out on turn 5 is fantastic, because that's another way, along with like your Questing Beast, of getting in that damage immediately, hopefully before your opponent has a chance to react to it. And that is how this deck wins, because you just keep saying, okay, for you with Questing Beast, go. Okay, you killed my Questing Beast. Okay, next turn, turn of food into a 3/3, play Questing Beast, hit you for 7, you're at 9 at best at this point. Next turn, maybe kill you with Sarkhan or something, I don't know. So this one's a little experimental, but, and I haven't playtested with it yet. As you can see, I haven't tried the list that has Scarring Hellcat yet outside of the event, but it was fantastic in my testing, and I'm definitely going to be running 2 or maybe 3 of them. So, anyway, that's going to wrap it up here. There's no real authority on this deck, so take everything that I say with a little bit of salt, because while my results have been amazing, it's not statistically significant, and also it's, you know, it's still pretty early in the format, honestly. So lots of things are still being tested out, and depending on where you are in the ladder and what sort of events you're playing, this might work better or worse. But it's always been really fun, and it always feels like there are cool decisions that you can make, and always ways that you can get yourself back into a game, even if you're on the back foot. Like mulls to 5 and then win happen all the time with this deck, because it just has so much explosive potential. So anyway, that's going to do it for tonight. Just want to talk about this deck and why I think it's so fun, and yeah, just share my love for it and spread it around. So, you know, it sounds like there might be an unexpected or a surprise banning coming up in the next few weeks, according to according to WotC's tweet today. So This is really good against Field. Maybe think about saving this up while Field is guaranteed around in case that gets banned sometime. So anyway, this has been Ben with the Tiger's Den. Thank you so much for joining us. Let us know what you think in the comments. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down and tell us how we could improve, what we could do better. Tell us what you'd like to see, stuff like that. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been Ben, and we will see you guys later. Bye-bye.